Welcome back to Missouri Caves and Speleology. I'm Toby Dogweiler. This module is a little different than most of the other modules we've done. We're not going to focus specifically on caves or speleology here, but we're going to fill in just a quick background on climate and climate change because that's a topic that we discuss in several other modules throughout the course. So this is some background information for you. Some information that we assume maybe you're a little bit familiar with but don't know a lot of the details, or maybe you have some questions about. All right, so the first slide that we're going to look at shows the annual temperature anomalies. These are global anomalies, so the average temperature for the whole globe each year relative to the average temperature for the 20th century. So the way a graph like this is created is they added up all the 100 years, the average temperature for each of the 100 years in the 20th century, took the average of those averages, and they called that sort of normal. Any line that's upward on this graph in colored red is a year that's warmer than that average, and any year that's colored blue and points downward on the graph is colder than normal. So what you see here is a definite pattern. All the first the first third or half of the 20th century, from about 1900 through the World War II era, all those years without exception are colder than average. They're blue lines. Then in the 50s, 60s, 70s, we see a transition where some years are warmer than average and some years are cooler than average. And then by the early 1980s, late 1970s, we see that years get progressively warmer, and there are no more years that are below the 20th century average. This is exactly the pattern in the data that you would expect in a warming Earth. If the Earth is warming, then the temperatures that we experienced 75 or 100 years ago should generally be colder than the temperatures we're experiencing now. And if we had this warming period, and as I defined, if the normal is based on the average for the whole century, then sometime in the middle of that century we should see a transition where we have some years that are above or below, and towards the end everything's warmer. And you can see over the past 35 or 40 years that solid red, the solid red portion of the graph, the temperatures get warmer and warmer. Some years are cooler than others, but by and large, it's hard to deny that there's a warming trend there. And if you look closely at the far right side of the graph, you see that the last few years have been the warmest years in the whole record. Another thing I would like to point out is if we look at these years since the early 1980s, our coldest year in that period is warmer than any year that occurred before that. And if we look at that period of cooler temperatures back in the early part of the 20th century, the warmest year in that picture, so the blue line that's closest to that center line on the graph, the shortest blue line, that would be the warmest year in that period. It's uniformly more cold than all the years later in the century. So this is why scientists have this strong consensus that the climate is changing. And we talk about that. This slide mentions that that about 90% of climate scientists agree that human activities have led to climate warming trends over the past 150 years. The graph I just showed you is one of the major pieces of evidence for that, and generally, as this says, almost all climate scientists agree on that. That doesn't mean that all climate scientists agree on everything. There's a lot of debate in the scientific community about climate, but it's not about whether climate is changing. It's about what we can do about that change, what these changes are going to mean in terms of how much sea level. Are we going to see a foot of sea level rise or a meter of sea level rise? That's something that is an active debate within the science. What impact is warming going to have on tornado frequency and magnitude, or hurricane frequency and magnitude? These are very open-ended questions that scientists are putting a lot of study into. So when we talk about the consensus is on these data that the Earth is warming. But there's a lot of details to be filled in about what the consequences of that will be. So what I'm going to show you here is some data that NASA has compiled, and it talks about some of the main lines of evidence that the Earth is changing, that climate is changing. The first one, we've looked at temperature already. We'll look at sea level rise. So global sea level has risen about 7 inches in the last century. A lot of that increase has come in more recent years, so we're starting to see an apparent increase in the rate of sea level change. And the slide here says that the rate in the last decade is nearly double the rate of the previous portion of that century. So sea level is going up. This fits with the observation that the Earth is warming. The warming Earth is causing other perturbations to the climate system. It's causing sea level to rise. The global temperature rise, we talked about that already. There are 4 or 5 agencies in different countries around the world that calculate global temperatures, and they have different methods and different means of doing that, and they have slightly different estimates about how much warming has occurred, but they all the different methodologies converge on the idea that the Earth has warmed and that the warmest years have generally been in the last decade or so. The oceans are warming, just like the air. Actually, think about how much heat or energy it takes to warm up water. You put a pot of water on your stove and you really have to heat it a while to get it to boil. Water can hold a ton of heat. So the oceans, the Earth being a water world with 3/4 of its surface covered by an ocean that's up to 12 or 15,000 feet deep, there's a lot of water out there. That water can absorb a lot of heat. So as the Earth has warmed up, a lot of that heat has actually been absorbed by the oceans and not by the atmosphere. So the warming we're seeing in the atmosphere is just a portion of the energy that the Earth has stored as a result of these changes. Ice sheets are shrinking. We can map these things out aerially from maps and satellite photos and so forth. For the most part, many places around the world are major ice sheets like Greenland. They're getting thinner and they're getting smaller. Portions of Antarctica are melting away. And then we can look at mountain glaciers too. And mountain glaciers in places like Glacier National Park and other glaciers in Alaska and Europe and the Alps and so forth. When we look around and compare the size of these glaciers now to the size they were 100 years ago by comparing photographs that people have taken from the same vantage point at 2 different points in time, or maps or satellite photos and so forth, we see that almost without exception, with just a couple of exceptions of all the glaciers that have been measured, almost all of them are retreating. So just more evidence towards this global climate change. The Arctic sea ice, the last few years, I believe in 2012, the Arctic sea ice reached the smallest extent it's ever reached during the summer in the northern hemisphere. This previous year of 2016, it wasn't quite as small of an extent, but it was small. And the graph here shows that through time, we only have about 30 or 40 years of data, but there is a definite downward trend. Some years are colder, some years are warmer, meaning some years have greater or lesser sea ice extent, but the overall trend through time has been downward. We can also just look at the weather that we experience day to day. You hear your meteorologist on your radio station or TV station every evening talk about the weather. And if you had a record high temperature or record low temperature, they usually mention that, maybe make a big deal out of it. If we lived in a climate that wasn't changing, so a steady climate, we'd expect over a year or a decade, some longer period of time, that we would see about as many record temperatures that are highs as lows. If the climate's not changing, the likelihood of both a record high and a low should be roughly equal. If the climate's changing, if it's getting warmer, we should see more record warm temperatures than record cold temperatures. Still occasionally see a cold temperature record, but we more frequently see high temperature records, and that's what we're indeed seeing over the last few decades. Some of the graphs here are pie charts for individual years. You see a year like 2012, which set a lot of records. Almost all of that pie for 2012 in the lower right is red. There are very few cold temperatures that year. Other years like 2009 were a little closer to 50-50, but when you look at the aggregate of a lot of years, you see that most years are like those 4 pies on the left or on the right side there. And finally, this is some evidence. I don't want you to think that climate change is just something that's going to affect polar bears or our grandchildren or people in far-off lands and times long from now. These are changes that are already affecting. These aren't the 2 maps on the on the left for 1990 and 2006 are the planting hardiness zone maps. So if you're a gardener, you've probably seen these at your nursery. For instance, much of Missouri is either in 1990 was zone 5 or 6, one of those green zones. Much of Missouri was the dark green, and so was much of Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. By 2006, 16 years later, most of Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio had moved into the next warmer zone of zone 6. And you see that in very southern Missouri, we even have some zone 7 areas down in the Boot Heel near Cape Girardeau and so forth. If we project these forward based on climate modeling and so forth, we see that if we do a lot of work to limit carbon emissions, we might keep these zones just changing a little bit, just a little further shift north. You see there, a little more yellow in the bottom of Missouri, a little more light green in the southern part of Iowa. If we do business as usual, if we keep just emitting at the rates we are now, look at the lower Midwest, Ohio, southern Illinois, southern Indiana, southern Missouri, all shift into zone 6. And if you haven't thought about this, I often, when I talk to people about climate, just the general population about climate, I often ask gardeners in the audience if they're planting something in their garden now that maybe 10 or 15 years ago they couldn't plant, or if they planted was unlikely to survive. And without exception, people have experienced that. When I first moved to Minnesota about 15 years ago, there were no redbud trees, a very common tree in Missouri and much of the Mid-South. By the time I left Minnesota 14 years later, in some of the warmer areas like the parks near lakes and stuff inside town, you could get redbud trees to survive now. So they're not quite native or the wild, they can't quite survive in the wild up there, but in certain situations they can. So we see these shifts in the flora and the fauna over time. So that's just a quick overview of some of the evidence that we use when we talk about changing climates, and a little primer for climate change. Thank you for joining us on Missouri Caves and Speleology. We'll see you next time.